ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
The UK's electricity grid is now coal-free. Last week it closed its last remaining coal-fired power station, earlier than expected, and became the first G7 economy to dump coal. Today, energy expert from the Grattan Institute, Alison Reeve, on how the Brits did it, and when and how we'll do the same. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Alison, when discussing the significance of this closure of the last coal-fired power station in the UK, it's good to delve back in history just briefly because, of course, the world's love affair with coal really began there a pretty long time ago, didn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, coal really drove the Industrial Revolution, particularly through the invention of steam power. It was first used for electricity in the UK in, I think, 1882,
Yes.
but it really grew really quickly after that. By 1920, the UK was generating about 4 terawatt hours of electricity from coal every year, and that was 97% of national demand. Most of that, though, was going to factories, not houses.
And the Brits, of course, inspired the rest of the world to follow.
Yes, that's right. I think everyone else realised that this was a better way to make electricity than the other options that we had available at the time.
Yeah, and there were controversies over time, of course, including this huge mining strike in the mid-80s under the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. So not without controversy.
The famous miners' strike in the 1980s was when Margaret Thatcher wanted to close down coal mining within the UK. And that was a very violent and troubled sort of time.
Nearly all of the 180,000 coal miners in Britain are on strike because they object to the government trying to close down unprofitable mines.
Within days, half the country's pits had closed. Pickets were soon at the gates of those that hadn't, and the clashes between miners and police began.
What we have seen in the past few weeks is not picketing at all. It is an attempt by force to prevent others from doing what they have a right to do.
But it is kind of important to remember that while this was a politically prominent event, the coal industry had been declining for a really long time. The number of people working in coal mining had more than halved between the 1950s and the 1970s, and then that dropped off again after the miners' strike.
And really, I suppose only more recently have we really come to terms with just how bad these coal-fired power stations are for the environment.
Well, I think we've come to understand that in new ways. So one of the things that has driven a lot of the change away from coal in previous decades has been about the impact that they have on air quality. But the other thing, of course, that we've come to understand is that coal is a very dirty way to make electricity, not just because of air pollution, but also because it creates carbon dioxide when you burn coal. And that is the major driver of climate change, which is impacting on our weather and our climate quite strongly.
Okay, well, Alison, last week on Monday at midnight, Britain's last coal-fired power plant, the Radcliffe-on-Soar station in central England, closed after more than 100 years of turning coal into power. That's a pretty momentous occasion, isn't it?
Yeah, it's got a lot of symbolic value, I think, because this makes the UK the first of the G7 nations to go without coal electricity. They're not the first European country. A number of European countries had phased out their coal previously, Portugal, for example, Austria. And a lot of countries never got into coal in the first place. But there is, I think, a symbolism to it, not just because they are a very large and important country, but also because they were the first country to have coal-fired power.
All right, so Alison, let's have a look now at how it's possible that a nation that at one point was almost entirely reliant on coal-fired power has managed to switch it off. Part of this, of course, comes down to politics and bipartisan politics. We had at one point Boris Johnson, of course, for the Conservatives, and Jeremy Corbyn for Labor, absolutely in step with each other on this.
It's time for humanity to grow up. It's time for us to listen to the warnings of the scientists. We need to pledge collectively to achieve carbon neutrality, net zero, by the middle of the century.
We have no time to waste. We are living in a climate crisis that will spiral dangerously out of control unless we take rapid and dramatic action now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was even earlier than that under the Blair government, there was also support for phasing out coal. But the phase-out kind of came in two phases. So the first bit was what they called the Dash for Gas, and this was in the late 80s and 90s. There were much stricter air pollution regulations that came in at that time and made it hard for coal to operate. And at the same time, the UK still had access to abundant gas resources from the North Sea. Then the second phase was from the mid-2000s, and what you had at that point was a combination of a legally binding emissions target and the EU emissions trading scheme, which meant that not only had the UK passed legislation to say that it would meet certain emissions targets, but also coal-fired generators were being asked to pay for their pollution. And that made it harder for them to operate economically. The other thing that sort of happened at that time too was the UK started to systematically support the growth of renewable generation, particularly wind, and also demand for energy fell a lot. Which was a combination of increased energy efficiency, but also because a lot of energy-intensive industry closed. And so all of those things together started to make it look like a fairly ambitious renewables target and an ambitious phase-out for coal were possible.
Okay, and what about nuclear energy? What role did that play in all of this?
So the UK had some nuclear power stations since the 1960s, but most of them were pretty old. Nuclear was about 13% of their electricity mix last year. The other thing that was helpful, though, is that the UK has a lot of transmission lines that connect it to mainland Europe, and it actually imports 5% of its electricity last year. So it's always got that insurance policy of being able to import electricity from France or Denmark or the Netherlands or Norway if it's running short and they happen to have power available.
Okay, so it was able to switch off coal because it had gas, nuclear power and, of course, renewables like wind and solar. But the UK also wants to transition away from gas too, doesn't it? So how's it going there, do we know?
Yeah, so the overall UK goal now is to decarbonise electricity production by 2030. And for that to happen, they have to phase out gas within 6 years. And that's about twice as fast as the coal phase out. The Labor government that has just been elected this year has committed to maintain a strategic reserve of gas, and that's to guarantee security. So I think the other question here as well is, while it looks like they might hit that 2030 goal, beyond, even though it is fairly challenging, but I think they can do it, beyond 2030, electricity demand is likely to grow quite steeply as they start to move away from using gas and oil in the rest of the economy. And so whether they're going to be able to maintain a carbon-free grid, I think is another question, because their electricity demand is going to be 50% higher by 2035.
Wow, sounds like a bit of a gamble then.
Yeah.
So, Alison, Britain is really leading the world in moving away from dirty energy. Let's look now at where we're up to, because safe to say we're a long way from doing likewise. We still have a lot of coal-fired power stations operating, don't we? Yeah,
so we've got 18 at the moment. There are 4 in New South Wales, 3 in Victoria, 3 in WA and 8 in Queensland. Now, half of those have announced that they're going to close before 2035. And all except one of them is likely to retire by 2051. So that isn't actually that far away, but there is a lot of coal that needs to come out of the system quite quickly.
Okay, it's worth noting that just before the UK went coal power free, Tanya Plibersek announced the expansion of 3 more coal mines, which has, of course, faced huge backlash from climate advocacy groups here.
There will be times, as a minister, that I make decisions that you don't like, but hard decisions are a part of this job, and I'm not going to shy away from them.
And, of course, unlike in the UK, we don't have that bipartisan policy. We've had a long run of Labor and the Coalition really fighting over this, haven't we?
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
As a country, we have to make the most of everything we have, and we've got all these coal resources.
If you put a price on something, then people will use less of it. At the moment, it is free to emit carbon pollution.
I think we've got a lot less policy certainty in general than the UK has, and that is not just because we lack bipartisan support, but also because the way that we have done the policy is a bit different. Australian policy has been focused on having replacement capacity in place before the coal retires, and that's largely been done through state government renewable energy targets and also a federal renewable energy target. So it's about pushing renewables in rather than a structured way of getting coal out. Most of those targets are focused on 2030, although some of the state targets go further. So Victoria is aiming to get to 95% renewables by 2035, for example. And of course, Tasmania is already mostly renewable, and South Australia has not had any coal since, I think, 2016.
So just remind me, where do the parties stand right now? We know, of course, that the Coalition is advocating for nuclear. Labor just want wind and solar, a green transition.
I think it's important to note that nobody's policy at the federal level at the moment is for 100% renewables. The ALP's target is to get to 82% renewables by 2030, with the balance of that to come from the remaining coal. And the way that they characterise it is that the most economic system for Australia is one that is wind and solar with some gas for backup and plenty of storage through things like batteries. So no one is advocating for a 100% renewable grid. The Coalition doesn't really have a policy at the moment. They have made some statements about wanting to encourage nuclear power, but we don't have any detail on what they want for the other generation sources or how much any of this is going to cost or what their overall objective is.
Okay, so then, given that...
I hesitate to call it a policy, I guess I'm saying.
Yes, so given that, how many years behind the UK are we?
I mean, if we look at the forecasts, we are 10 years off most of the coal being closed. So that is actually quite fast in terms of building new infrastructure. And one of the things about the UK experience is to note that it happened slowly and then quite quickly, and I think ours will be similar as well. The thing is that we are missing the key pieces of policy that the UK had to drive this. We don't have a price on carbon, so all of our coal-fired generators are free to pollute as much as they like. We don't have a definite date and a plan that creates certainty. We don't have any certainty around the role of gas other than sort of motherhood statements from both sides of politics about gas being important, but none of them have actually said what the UK has said, which is we will have a strategic reserve of a particular size. We don't actually have a nuclear policy as the UK does, and we don't have that interconnectedness between different grid regions in the same way that the UK does. So I think we're really missing a lot of the key pieces that they have had to make their transition orderly.
And do we need that bipartisanship, which we saw in the UK?
The reason you need the bipartisanship is because we're talking about the need to build a lot of very expensive assets over time. And if you don't have bipartisan support about where you're going and what the pathway looks like, no one will invest in that big build. And so that's the reason that bipartisanship is important, is because without it, we won't get the investment.
So as someone who studies this every day, what's your feeling about our progress?
I think we will end up with a very high percentage of renewables in the grid by 2030. I don't know that it'll be 82%, and in some ways it doesn't matter. If we only get to 75% renewable in our grid by 2030, that will actually be a stupendous achievement. The thing we can learn from the UK is that you need to actually have structured and detailed policy if you want to make this transition happen smoothly. And we're really missing that in a couple of key places at the moment.
Alison Reeve is the Deputy Program Director of Energy and Climate Change at the Grattan Institute. This episode was produced by Cara Jensen McKinnon and Sydney Peed. Audio production by Anna John. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.